Good afternoon. My name's Felicia Wong, and as the Roosevelt Institute's president and CEO, it is my real honor to welcome you to our first webinar of 2022. And it's a real pleasure to welcome as our distinguished guest, Ambassador Katherine, the U.S. Trade Representative. I want to start by reminding all of us that we are at a critical juncture in the history of our economy, both domestically and globally. Already at the start of this year, the intertwined crises of pandemics, inequality, climate, and racial inequality were pushing us at Roosevelt and pushing many of our allies to think in a thoroughgoing way about economic transformation and about everything we need to do to boost our collective resilience. But this is now even more important because Russia's unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine has increased calls for a more substantial decoupling of the fate of democratic countries from reliance on authoritarian, fossil fuel financed governments and their allies. And frankly, these episodes have also forced us to hold a mirror up to ourselves. We have oligarchs at home in the fossil fuel industry and on Wall Street who are using their influence over the political establishment to thwart even common sense reforms, like taking into account the financial risks posed by climate change. That said, we at the Roosevelt Institute are champions of the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor, and therefore we're in the optimism business. We understand the enormity of the challenges we face, and we look towards a better future. That's why I'm really excited about today's event, because at the top, we'll hear from Ambassador Tai, who's transformed the focus of trade policy to put workers and the environment first. And then, after the ambassador's remarks, we'll hear from a distinguished group of panelists, Professors Tim Meyer, Erin Mayfield, and Saule Omarova, who are all at the forefront of reimagining how to use public power to structure markets for the common good. Welcome to all of you. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Tai, who was sworn in as the 19th USTR in March of 2021, and as a member of the president's cabinet, who is responsible for the she's the principal trade advisor, negotiator, and spokesperson on trade policy. Prior to her unanimous Senate confirmation, Ambassador Tai spent most of her career in public service focused on international economic diplomacy, monitoring, and enforcement in both the executive and the legislative branches. And because she previously served as litigator for the United States at the World Trade Organization, she knows firsthand that the trade policy of the last few decades is desperately in need of a new balance. She's a real visionary, and I'm thrilled to welcome her to our virtual stage. With that, Ambassador Tai.
Thank you, Felicia, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to join today's webinar. In fact, it's an honor and a delight to engage in this conversation. I'd like to take a moment to reflect on how far we've come in the first year of the Biden administration, before highlighting some of the opportunities presented by U.S. efforts to craft with the European Union what we are calling the global arrangement, and what we intend to be the world's first carbon-based sectoral agreement on steel and aluminum trade. As I was going through the Senate confirmation process and being sworn in as United States Trade Representative 1 year ago, U.S. trade policy discussions were dominated by the topic of tariffs. Tariffs are a legitimate tool of trade policy, especially as a measure to defend American workers and producers against unfair trade practices like dumping and illegal subsidization by other countries. At the start of 2021, however, a significant cognitive dissonance had developed in U.S. trade policy. No one disputed the fact that the global market for both steel and aluminum was substantially and artificially distorted by the excessive buildup of production capacity, a phenomenon driven primarily, but not solely, by the PRC's industrial policies, and that the result over the past 2 decades has been to drive out producers and eliminate livelihoods in these critical industries, not just here in America, but in all market-based economies like ours. And yet, U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs had generated a deep rancor with some of our closest partners and allies, countries and economies whose workers and producers have been similarly harmed by global overcapacity in these industries. For those most conversant with trade policy and foreign policy, those familiar with the strength of European industrial strategy and workers' rights movements, the transatlantic tensions over steel and aluminum trade seemed particularly problematic. If Europe was not driving global overcapacity and Europe was also being hurt by it, why had a particularly bitter fight developed between America and Europe? From the very start of President Biden's tenure, he made clear that America was back and that America's frayed friendships and partnerships would be mended. At the same time, President Biden also made clear that he wanted a new approach to trade policy, a worker-centered trade policy that fosters a new version of globalization that values and invests in our people and planet. In both of our negotiations with the EU last year, first settling the 17-year-old large civil aircraft dispute between Boeing and Airbus, and again on steel and aluminum trade, we carried out the president's instruction to walk and chew gum at the same time. In these cases, that meant to repair the relationship with Europe, while at the same time defending the rights of America's industries and workers to grow, compete, and innovate in an unfairly distorted global marketplace. And that is why the resulting agreement on steel and aluminum that we concluded with the EU last October resumes duty-free trade between our economies, but with important guardrails that will remain in place while we continue to work together towards a long-term arrangement that ensures both fair and clean trade in these industrial sectors. Our world has recently been beset by the challenges of surviving the COVID-19 pandemic and now also a war that Russia's President Putin has chosen to wage. But our world has and continues to grapple with the challenges that unfair trade practices place on market economy workers and producers, as well as a growing climate crisis. And that is why it is important that we not lose sight of this significant achievement. In just 1 year, the Biden administration has transformed a deep rift in transatlantic trade relations into a collaborative and innovative partnership between the U.S. and EU to craft what will be the world's first carbon-based arrangement on steel and aluminum trade. Trade agreements have traditionally been driven by a sole focus on lowering costs, often with little attention paid to the resulting impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Without a way to account for those emissions, the environmental harm is neither captured nor paid. Our current trade frameworks incentivize and reward cheap and dirty production, the definition of the race to the bottom. The agreement that we are negotiating will be powerful because it will drive demand to reduce these costs and create a race to the top. By increasing demand for less carbon-intensive steel and aluminum produced by American and European companies, we can account for the cost of high-carbon steel and help clean industries succeed. To create positive and durable environmental change, our vision requires that other leading countries and economies participate too. Critically, this advances President Biden's climate agenda and demonstrates that trade can and must be both a tool in tackling the climate crisis and a tool for promoting fair competition. This deal will enable us to work with the EU to address a common challenge in global overcapacity issues, while also pushing back the costs of dirty, non-market steel and aluminum onto China. A broad coalition celebrated President Biden's announcement with the EU last October on steel and aluminum trade. We are deeply grateful for the support from labor and environmental organizations like the United Steelworkers, the Clean Air Task Force, the National Wildlife Foundation, the American Iron and Steel Institute, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and, of course, the Roosevelt Institute. Of course, that announcement was just the start. Our ambitions require follow-through, and I look forward to working with Executive Vice President Dombrovskis, Congress, and our stakeholders on both sides of the Atlantic to deliver over these next 2 years. What this agreement offers us is a high-standard example for the rest of the world to follow, and a concrete manifestation of President Biden's worker-centered trade policy, a trade policy for our future that drives towards higher standards for our workers, our industries, and our environment. With the cooperation of the Roosevelt Institute and the esteemed participants of today's event, we will be working hard and pushing ourselves and each other to advance this vision through the seminal opportunity afforded by the US-EU negotiations on the global arrangement. Once again, thank you for inviting me to join today's event.
Thank you to Felicia and to Ambassador Ty for sharing these opening thoughts with us today. As Roosevelt Institute's Director of Industrial Policy and Trade, I'm particularly excited that our first webinar of the year is focused on the new global arrangement on steel and aluminum. While we're heading into our panel, feel free to drop questions into the chat, which will go directly to our team. We're not going to be using Q&A or the raising hand function today, but please give your name and affiliation and your question. And disclaimer, we may not be able to get to all of them, but we will try. And before we dive into the panel, we'd love to hear what interests or excites you most about the green steel deal. We've put up a poll, and would love to hear what aspect of it is most interesting to you. So now we're going to turn to our panel. Professor Timothy Meyer is a professor of law and the director of international legal studies at Vanderbilt University Law School. Dr. Erin Mayfield is assistant professor of engineering at Dartmouth University. And Dr. Saule Omarova is a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and professor of law at Cornell Law School. And then after our panel, we'll hear a brief word from a special guest, Jane Flegel, who is the Senior Director for Industrial Emissions at the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy. We're very happy that she was able to join as well. So while the bulk of our conversation today is going to focus on the implications for this deal for policy and politics more broadly, I think it's useful to start out the conversation with a few of just the basics about the steel and aluminum industry. These industries are a source of union jobs in the economy and produce goods on which our national security and economy and other industries rely. At the same time, they're among the top highest greenhouse gas emitting industries within the overall industrial sector, and are on track, which the sector as a whole is on track to overtake the energy and transportation sectors in overall emissions. It is estimated that these industries need to cut emissions substantially by 2050 if we are able to meet climate goals. And crucially, from a Roosevelt Institute perspective, the producers and workers in these industries provided a vital channel for the success of the New Deal and World War II economic mobilization, and now today stand to do the same as part of the green transition over the coming decades. I'll turn first to Dr. Meyer. Tim, we've just heard from Ambassador Ty about how this deal fits in with this emerging and changing US trade goals. Notably, this deal is not taking place under the auspices of the World Trade Organization or WTO. Could you talk about why this deal is happening now and in the way that it is?
Sure, Todd. Thank you so much. And thanks to Felicia and Ambassador Ty and to the Roosevelt Institute for the opportunity to be here today. So the World Trade Organization and its predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, has in some ways been one of the most successful international organizations in terms of spurring the growth of global trade. But like a lot of organizations, international organizations, it's been the victim of its own success in some ways. So the World Trade Organization currently has 164 members and has not successfully completed negotiations on any subject since it was created in 1995. And this has basically rendered the WTO not fit as a negotiating forum in which countries can come together to address some of the major challenges of the 21st century, and in particular, the nexus of climate change and trade. Now, for years, we've seen countries, because of the gridlock of the WTO, shift negotiations to regional free trade agreements as an alternative in which like-minded countries are able to pursue their objectives. And so in some sense, the global arrangement is just a continuation of that kind of policy, getting like-minded countries together to address an issue of common concern in a format that isn't going to be held hostage by the WTO's consensus-driven decision-making process. So in one respect, that's why this is happening outside of the WTO. Probably the best example of the WTO's difficulties, I think, is probably the fisheries negotiations. So the WTO has been trying to conclude an agreement to rein in fisheries subsidies, which are, among other things, terrible for the climate because of the emissions they produce. They've been trying to do this for 20 years, and they just have not been able to bring that across the finish line. I think a lot of folks view that as kind of a litmus test for whether the WTO can be a successful negotiating forum, particularly on environmental matters. It just looks as if we're going to need a new approach to address climate, the nexus of climate and the environment. The second reason is that over time, the WTO has become really excessively legalized. And you've seen dispute resolution panels convened under the auspices of the WTO really take a very narrow view of what the extent to which governments have what our European colleagues sometimes call a margin of appreciation for pursuing policies that might in some ways interact or restrict trade liberalization. And Ambassador Tai herself actually had a great comment to this effect. She says that while at the speaking about the WTO, while countries can avail themselves of what amounts to an affirmative defense, that's an affirmative defense for environmental measures, that defense has proven difficult to invoke successfully. That's part of the reason why today the WTO is considered by many as an institution that not only has no solutions to offer on environmental concerns, but is part of the problem. The WTO just simply hasn't been able to adapt either in its negotiating function or in its dispute resolution function to the needs of its members to address these concerns. So that's why I think we don't see this initiative unrolling at the WTO. What I do think, though, is that this looks pretty similar to an approach that's been very successful in the environmental space, which is the Montreal Protocol. The most successful climate change agreement ever is the Montreal Protocol to reduce ozone depleting substances. It occurred outside the auspices of what was then the GATT. And it looked to employ trade sanctions against countries that didn't adopt the environmental policies dictated by the agreement. Those sanctions, those methods were never challenged within the GATT or later the WTO. And it's been pretty successful, and it's got some similarities to the steel sector as well. So one of the things that makes the steel sector, I think, such a promising avenue to pursue this kind of global arrangement is that the industry has generally been supportive of decarbonization. And you saw when the US and the EU announced the global arrangement that the steel sector in particular was generally supportive of the idea that with appropriate monitoring mechanisms, we'd be able to use this agreement as a vehicle to decarbonize this sector that does constitute such a huge percentage of global emissions, both today and going forward. And so when you start to think about the idea of a club-based approach like the Montreal Protocol, like the global arrangement, and you see that you've got the backing of industry and you've got the backing of the US and its allies in Europe, I think you start to see the makings of a policy that's likely to be very effective as what we might think of as sort of a demonstration project of the broader applicability of trade policy as part of a toolkit to pursue decarbonization. And so, I think those two things, Todd, are really why we see this taking the direction that it is. On the one hand, the paralysis at the WTO, and on the other hand, this successful model we have for club-driven approaches to environmental and trade policies when you have industry support in the countries that are willing to pursue high ambition policies.
Thanks, Tim. Very interesting. When a law professor says something is overly legalistic, I think our audience will definitely take note of that. So turning now to Dr. Mayfield, Erin, even though this is a trade deal, it's not happening in isolation from a domestic strategy. And in fact, the administration has, since the Green Steel deal was announced a further series of measures on domestic decarbonization of steel and aluminum. Your research has looked into the the benefits to workers and communities from having a strong industrial sector. What are some of the benefits that you're seeing in the research for this type of a dual trade and domestic strategy as it relates to U.S. workers and U.S. communities?
Thanks for the question, Todd, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. So certainly there are important potential interactions between the trade deal and policies and associated benefits that are focused on decarbonizing domestic industrial sectors, including steel. So from the perspective of domestic strategy, there are many policies that need to progress in tandem or sequence in order to decarbonize US industries while also meeting labor and environmental justice objectives. So as the US decarbonizes, there's going to be an increasing demand for products derived from steel and aluminum like EVs and wind turbines and solar panels. So policies like clean energy standards and EV purchase subsidies and incentives drive demand for these products. Domestic policies like federal or state procurement provisions can also help ensure that demand is met through materials that are produced through low carbon processes. And there's also other important federal funding streams to demonstrate technologies and infrastructure like CO2 pipeline networks and hydrogen hubs that are necessary enabling actions that will drive large emission reductions in domestic industrial sectors in the future. So building out this domestic infrastructure, including redevelopment of industrial brownfield sites, has the potential to create benefits in historically overburdened and low-income communities. So labor provisions like domestic content share requirements for products, prevailing wage or fair wage provisions, and local hiring requirements all can help drive growth in domestic energy jobs. And these labor provisions are not only important in terms of benefiting the American worker and creating benefits in these historical manufacturing communities, but also these labor provisions are important for firms because it helps to retain the workforce and meet increasing labor demands. So in turn, these labor provisions are all important in meeting domestic climate targets because they're helping to mitigate labor supply bottlenecks and supply chain bottlenecks. Also importantly, decarbonization of these industrial facilities will reduce not only greenhouse gas emissions, but also in part reduce criteria air pollutant emissions, and these impact public health. So currently and historically, air pollution associated with the operations of steel facilities, in addition to several other industries, are regressive, such that the lowest income populations have the highest air pollution induced mortality rates and other health impacts. So domestic decarbonization of industrial facilities has important public health benefits and helps to upend some of the existing environmental injustices embedded within our infrastructure systems. And there's also potential environmental benefits in terms of remediation of historical groundwater and surface water pollution. Many of these steel sites are quite old, some over 100 years old, so there's substantial legacy and pollution in some cases, and so redevelopment of these sites can also generate water quality benefits. So overall, these domestic policies and strategies are important to help maximize domestic benefits from the trade deal.
Thanks, Erin. Now, finally, turning to Dr. Omarova. Saule, we've just heard from Tim and Erin about what appears to be, dare I say it, industrial policy, which not too long ago, the International Monetary Fund was calling the policy that we dare not speak its name. So you're one of the world's foremost experts on the financing and governance of industrial policy. What are some of the tools and strategies we could use to make these plans on both the international and domestic side actually happen?
Well, thank you very much, Todd, for this great question. You're absolutely correct. The Green Steel Trade Agreement is a big step toward what is indeed promising to become America's new industrial strategy. Of course, successfully implementing this emerging strategy requires plentiful and reliable financing over both short and long terms. An economy-wide shift to clean products and technologies is a capital-intensive process with a long lifespan. It will take a tremendous amount of ongoing investment to generate economic, environmental, and social benefits spread well into the future. It will also require a great deal of coordination among many actors and on many levels to ensure that capital is deployed to the maximum benefit of the American people. To provide this type of strategically coordinated long-term industrial financing, the US government needs new tools, much stronger, more flexible, and more effective than what it currently has at its disposal. So there are two essential components to what is needed. First, resources, capital, and second, a dedicated institutional platform for managing those resources and directing public investment. The good news is the Biden administration and US Congress have already committed to ramping up investment in US infrastructure and supply chains. Several legislative proposals currently in front of the Congress, including the Build Back Better Act and America Competes Act, seek to allocate significant sums of money to rebuilding domestic industries. And there are also some encouraging signs with respect to creating new institutions of public finance. For example, recently introduced Industrial Finance Corporation Act envisions the creation of a new government corporation, the IFC, specifically to invest in US manufacturing. These are all steps in the right direction, especially if these bills become law. But the challenges we're facing today demand more than that. The current push to rebuild our domestic industrial capacity creates a crucial opening for rethinking our approach to financing America's economy. For the past several years, I've been working on a proposal to establish a National Investment Authority, or NIA, as this type of a next generation institution of public investment in infrastructure and industrial growth. So the proposed NIA would have a broad mandate to devise a comprehensive and dynamic national investment strategy, establishing strategic priorities for specific industries, products, and geographic regions in need of greater capital investment, and then channel both public and private capital into these industries, projects, and communities. As an independent federal agency, the NIA would operate alongside the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve and fill the critical gap between fiscal and monetary policies. The NIA would act directly in financial markets, not only as a lender, guarantor, and secondary market maker, but also as an equity investor, venture capitalist, and asset manager. In effect, the NIA will use both traditional credit and the more innovative and flexible equity tools to finance various publicly beneficial projects which otherwise would not get funded in private markets or through fiscal policy channels. So these are likely to be large-scale transformative projects that are necessary in order to build a resilient, clean economy, but that involve high risks, perhaps of untested new technologies or long investment horizons. So to invest in these types of projects, for example, the NIA will set up and manage a series of public-private funds. It will partner with institutional investors like pension funds, seeking reasonable and safe returns on their capital to unlock new opportunities for private firms and entrepreneurs, employee-owned businesses, and public entities willing to undertake these projects across many sectors. The NIA will also actively coordinate and manage these investments to ensure that they actually produce the intended public benefits in a truly synergistic way. Basically, the NIA can be thought of as a hybrid between a federal development bank, a broad purpose industrial Fannie Mae, if you will, and a publicly owned BlackRock. And I realize it is a complex and ambitious proposal, but to stay globally competitive and internally strong, America needs this type of institutional statecraft and forward thinking. In fact, both the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine underscore the urgency of this task. And my hope is that today's discussion becomes part of a serious national conversation on these important issues.
Thank you, Saule, for those insights. We'll do another round of questions with the panel, and I'm going to be incorporating some of your Q&A from the audience as well into this round before then hearing from Jane Flagel and then opening up to a full Q&A. So Tim, we've gotten a few questions in the chat about how other countries will react to this new global arrangement. And in particular, we've heard from Simon Lester from World Trade Law Net asking, if China and other sort of major producers of steel and aluminum adopt clean production techniques, how can they expect to be treated? And then we've also gotten a question from Stephen Hudart from the Transition Accelerator, which is a Canadian nonprofit, asking what provisions can Canada expect and how will Canadian steel be treated under this deal? Wondering if you could address some of those questions, Tim.
Sure. So the administration has indicated that it's open to countries that are going to pursue high ambition decarbonization policies to participate in this global arrangement. That was part of the discussion with Japan that ultimately led to a replacement for the 232 measures with Japan, although Japan has taken a slightly more wait and see approach, I think, to some of these negotiations. But I think with respect to the question about Canada, I think, Canada has obviously been one of the US's closest allies. I imagine that there is a role for Canada to participate within this system if Canada is willing to engage in these kinds of negotiations. Simon's question is a little bit trickier. So in principle, I think the answer should be yes, that if China were to pursue decarbonization methods, if it were to pursue the same kinds of high ambition policies that we see in the US, in Europe, and hopefully accelerating in the US and Europe, then in principle, yes. Now, there's a couple of things that are going to have to be worked out in the development of the global arrangement. One of those things, the US and the EU are going to convene a technical working group on this, is just basically how you account for emissions in the sector in order to sort of figure out, how are we doing? How do we measure progress within the global arrangement? And so there would be a question, of course, about how that intersects with the Chinese model of production. The second issue is what you do with state subsidies and the market-oriented nature, right? So because an important part of the global arrangement is that not only that you pursue decarbonization policies, but also that you pursue market-oriented reforms. And in particular, again, we saw in the agreement with Japan that there was some indication that Japan was going to pursue reforms that were designed to essentially protect the market-oriented structure of its steel industry. And so, I think that's a pretty significant challenge for China. It's also a challenge, as Saule and Erin were just talking about, it's also a challenge, I think, for the US and the EU to figure out what kinds of subsidies are going to be permitted under the global arrangement, and what kind of subsidies are going to lead to, or what kind of state support are going to lead to the concerns about an excessively state interventionist model in the steel sector. And I think that's a problem that the US, the EU, and any countries that choose to join them are going to really have to think through carefully, and clearly would have application to countries like China. Some
Tim. Erin, we're getting some questions in the chat, including from Justin McCulca from New Consensus about about why what are some of the hurdles to having sort of greater take up of clean production techniques in the US. I'm wondering from your research if you could talk about that, or some of the other hurdles that need to be addressed in order to really see the types of domestic decarbonization we want to see in the industrial sector.
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned in my previous remarks, there's a lot of interacting domestic policies that have to happen, and those stimulate building of associated infrastructure like CO2 transmission networks and hydrogen networks and hubs, and building these regional hubs and economies. So all of these have to happen, are enabling actions, and have to happen in sequence and in tandem. I'd also say that, going back to some other things that I mentioned, like labor provisions, including domestic content share incentives for materials and products, they're all important to create a domestic industry and derive domestic benefits. So some procurement provisions like Buy America would harness a lot of the federal government's massive purchasing power to support low carbon materials made in factories or manufacturing facilities, and analogous policies at the state level, especially states with larger economies where they can kind of pool producers to decarbonize, and driving demand for these low carbon products, as well as different corporate procurement commitments as well, are also important. So part of it is a question of demand for these products, and another part of it is kind of building all the enabling infrastructure as well, beyond kind of decarbonizing facilities themselves.
Saule, turning to you, you've written extensively about the economic distortions imposed by excessive financialization of the economy. How can some of the new industrial policy tools that you discussed earlier, how can they help us address the problem of over-financialization of the economy?
Yes, well, financialization is, of course, a complex phenomenon, has many facets, but at bottom, it denotes a dysfunctional dynamic whereby capital is increasingly trapped inside financial markets and used to fuel speculative trading instead of fueling the growth of the real economy. It's sort of the tail wagging the dog kind of a situation. So new, much more capacious and proactive institutions of public investment, like the National Investment Authority that I'm proposing, should be designed to counteract this trend. For example, the NIA would serve as the new source of patient capital for infrastructure, manufacturing, R&D, and other projects that are currently starved of investment. It will also create a healthy competition to Wall Street institutions that currently control capital allocation and thus cause these existing distortions. The NIA would offer attractive new outlets for investors to put their money to productive rather than speculative uses, which will create real jobs for real people and generate sustainable long-term economic growth. So, for example, currently pension funds are major investors in private equity funds, many of which generate returns by over-leveraging or breaking up companies they buy, laying off their workers, and hurting local economies. Well, the NIA would offer pension funds a chance to reduce their reliance on private equity while still getting steady returns from hard assets and strengthening their own base. So in short, that type of institutional reform would fundamentally change the dynamics of our financial system and will reconnect finance and the real economy so that capital does what it is supposed to be doing, make everyone and not just the financiers better off, and make our collective future more prosperous and secure.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think what we're hearing today on today's panel is that there really is a lot of deep interconnections between our international strategy and our domestic strategy, and then how these sectors connect to other sectors of the economy like finance. So very important. Before we open it up to sort of a full Q&A with the audience, I'd like to invite Jane Flagle, Senior Director for Industrial Emissions at the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy, to offer sort of some initial reactions and thoughts as to where she sees this work going forward. Jane?
Thanks, Todd. Hopefully you guys can all hear me. I want to thank the organizers and the panelists today, maybe in particular Dr. Mayfield's cat, who made a brief but stunning appearance, and Ambassador Ty for what has been, to my mind, an incredibly creative, stimulating, and exciting discussion. As Todd said, I'm the Senior Director for Industrial Emissions at the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy. And so my entirely unbiased view is that this conversation is focused on the most important sector of the economy. And in all seriousness, it is true that from a climate perspective, industrial emissions are on track to be the industry is on track to be the highest emitting sector of the economy in the United States under any post-COVID economic recovery scenario within the next 5 years. It is incredibly important for us to achieve the president's ambitious climate objectives, for us to decarbonize the industrial sector as rapidly as possible. And so I thought maybe I would zoom out briefly before zooming back in and say a word about the administration's strategy on industrial decarbonization more generally, and then in particular, the really important role we see trade playing in helping to accelerate decarbonization, not only domestically, but globally. So obviously much of the conversation we're having today is focused on the global arrangement on aluminum and steel, which we're incredibly excited about and first announced in October. Todd also mentioned a package of announcements that the administration rolled out in February of this year on industrial decarbonization more broadly. And I will not go into the detail of all of the announcements contained in that rollout, but just to say a few things. We are working to implement historic investments in the deployment of clean hydrogen, which has an incredibly important role to play in decarbonizing the steel industry. innovation across other technologies and processes, new actions to help scale carbon capture responsibly in some of these sectors. And Dr. Mayfield mentioned the important role that the administration sees sort of across the board for leveraging public procurement to create markets for all kinds of goods. I think we're especially excited about the announcement in February that we are standing up the first ever Buy Clean task force that I'm co-chairing with my colleagues at CEQ to help ensure that as the United States buys materials and goods, we buy America and we buy decarbonized. And so we're really excited about that work moving forward. I think what both the October announcement of the global arrangement and the February rollout helped to crystallize is the president's approach to climate more broadly takes very seriously a couple of things. One, really taking a whole of government approach to tackling these problems, which are massive. And that means not just looking at some of the tools that have traditionally been thought of as climate policy tools, but looking everywhere, including our trade regimes. That to me is incredibly exciting. And secondly, doing this in a way that, captures the enormous economic opportunity the president sees associated with the clean energy transition while creating high-wage union jobs. And that strategy is not only good on the merits, but also about stitching together a coalition to support and sustain more aggressive decarbonization over time. And so I think we're especially excited about this work. On the global arrangement in particular, much has been said about the importance of the aluminum and steel sector. I just want to underscore a few things. One, as others have made clear, we're talking about upwards of 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions represented by those two industries. And as Tim and Erin said, especially in light of the energy transition, demand for these materials is only going to grow in the coming years, and we really have to meet that demand in a way that is clean. Secondly, and I think Erin has been really articulate on this, we have, while it is true that these sectors are responsible for a significant chunk of carbon pollution, they are also often responsible for very serious other kinds of pollution, including air toxics. And there's a real opportunity as we move forward with a climate agenda in these sectors to reduce other kinds of pollution and deliver concrete benefits to communities living around these facilities, which is obviously very central to the president's approach to climate more generally. Third, I think, as has been revealed in COVID and now in the war in Ukraine, we are seeing the importance of sustaining and reinvigorating domestic manufacturing because of the long run economic benefits and jobs benefits associated with those investments. And then maybe lastly, I think folks are incredibly attuned today to the national security imperative of having robust supply chains in these areas. So we really see an opportunity, and we saw an opportunity with the global arrangement to tackle not only global overcapacity, as Ambassador Tai so eloquently stated, but also climate in a way that wins the support of American industries and workers, incentivizing domestic and global decarbonization. I'll say a few more things before stopping and turning it back to the panel. I think on the importance of trade generally for decarbonizing our aluminum and steel industries, I think there are a couple of things that we see as really key here. One is coming up with a way to more systematically embed climate considerations in trade is important because it will help us address barriers to domestic decarbonization today by tackling dirty overcapacity, which is today discouraging investment in low carbon production methods. The current state of the market is not well suited to drive additional investments in these areas. And so that's number one. Number two, and I think as others have said, we see a really important role for trade regimes to help align real material incentives to cultivate a race to the top domestically and globally. And that includes, expanding market access for clean products, clean aluminum and steel, and restricting market access for those dirty products. And that's, I think, a really important way to think about international climate cooperation, actually. And the third thing I'll say, which we haven't talked about that much yet, but given the conversation about WTO, I just want to raise here, I think one of the things that we see as central to the global arrangement is that it helps to establish a kind of new norm in climate and trade of measuring what matters, which is the emissions embedded in these goods. Much of the conversation about climate and trade to date has focused on the sort of requirement of explicit carbon pricing. And in our view, that's not and really cannot be the case. The climate issue is just far too urgent to require uniform global policy instruments to make progress. And I think that's consistent with the Paris Agreement, but I just want to flag that here as something we haven't discussed very much, but I think it's worth highlighting. So thank you again to the panel today and to Roosevelt Institute in particular for convening this really exciting conversation. I think there's a tremendous amount of promise in the global arrangement, and we're obviously hard at work negotiating the details. And it's going to be a really fun and important challenge. And we're quite eager to hear from stakeholders. And again, very grateful to the work of all of you on today's call.
Thanks, Jane. And yeah, I think that some of the points that you're hitting are exactly the kinds of questions that we're getting in the chat. From Marley Morris from the UK, ask, how do you see this global arrangement fitting in with the EU's plans to adopt a carbon border adjustment mechanism? And then from Olof Larsson from Sweden, the University of Gothenburg, we're hearing where is the UK position in all of this? Both I think as it relates to pricing, but also as it relates to the club. Tim, maybe you want to start there.
Sure. So the United States and the UK are in consultations, similar to the consultations the US went through with the EU and Japan. If we were sort of anticipating what UK policy looks like, the UK still is sitting off of, although not part of the EU anymore, is still sitting right off the coast of the EU. And so, I think one might imagine that the UK, if one was forecasting, is likely to come to some sort of similar arrangement along the lines of what the EU agrees with the US. In this vein, although it perhaps may take a bit longer, and the road may be a bit more winding. With respect to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, there's been a lot of debate within the EU since that proposal was rolled out as to how that proposal would be implemented, and then since the announcement of the global arrangement, what the relationship between the two would be. As Jane just mentioned, one of the initial concerns with the CBAM is that the CBAM did appear to prioritize or to even attempt to coerce countries into adopting explicit carbon pricing mechanisms. It did this by crediting importers only for explicit carbon prices that were paid in the home market, but not for the cost of complying with other kinds of decarbonization measures or making other kinds of decarbonization efforts. So that's a potential WTO problem. It's the reason, as Jane suggested, that we might want to pivot outside of the WTO with its sort of focus on carbon pricing. And it makes it a challenge to think about how to integrate CBAM with the global arrangement. One idea is that the global arrangement could be basically an alternative to CBAM with respect to the members of the global arrangement, with respect to steel and aluminum. Another idea that has, I think, gained more traction in the European Parliament would be that the global arrangement operated sort of on top of or was enmeshed in some way within CBAM. And I think those are details that remain to be worked out. CBAM itself is obviously moving through the process towards ultimate enactment within the European Union. And these are things that are going to have to be fleshed out over the coming years.
Thanks. And we're getting some questions about sort of to what extent is the approach, this sectoral approach generally, or the steel and aluminum deal specifically, a response to learning some of the lessons from sort of failed or challenged approaches on environmental policy in the past. In particular, we have a question from Gabriel Whale. How applicable is the Montreal Protocol model to greenhouse gas emissions, given the much more daunting commons problem for greenhouse gases than for CFCs? for which unilateral phase out passed a domestic cost benefit test for most parties to Montreal. If Erin or other folks on the panel want to address that, and just also sort of generally, to what extent are we sort of, is this particular approach a response to things we didn't get right in the past?
So maybe I'll speak briefly, and going back to what Jane said, it's this all of government approach, and also as the line that you hear over and over again as well, is that you're using every tool in the toolbox and seeing what works, and multiple tools that have to work in tandem.
I would just say on the Montreal Protocol, comparison, to the extent that the point is that decarbonization and climate change represents a much more sort of economy-wide problem than did the elimination of CFCs and other kinds of ozone depleting substances. I think that's a fair point. I mean, as Erin just said, right, the problem we're dealing with today is a much more difficult problem, which calls for much more, because it's more difficult, much more aggressive action, and really this sort of all of government, everything in the toolkit kind of approach. But the basic model, the idea that we would use basically a club-like approach in which you would enlist trade policy in order to address an environmental consideration, that's something that we did to great success with the Montreal Protocol. It's something that by and large did not happen during the WTO era, in part because of concerns at the WTO, and particularly these kinds of legal concerns about the kinds of policies that would pass WTO muster. And so I think the global arrangement and the broader sort of decarbonization of the industrial sector reflects a pivot back to policies that have worked in the past and away from the sort of policies that haven't really served us well over the course of the last 2 decades.
Great. Well, we are coming up to close to time, but just we were getting a number of questions from the audience, essentially related to how this can, what are some of the opportunities to link up this EU-US strategy with the needs of developing countries. So would open the floor to any of the panel that wants to speak to that, or just generally to sort of make some closing remarks from your own observations about the panel thus far. So I guess I'll start, we'll go in the order that we started with. So I'll start with Tim and then go to the others.
Sure. I think the question of how this affects developing countries is an incredibly important one, both for the long-term success of the decarbonization enterprise. I mean, one of the things we know is that, we in the United States, we need to decarbonize, the Europeans need to decarbonize. It's critical that you see decarbonization in places like China if we're going to successfully tackle the climate change problem. But the developing world more generally has an interest in developing its economies. So it really is both in our own interest as well as sort of a moral imperative, I think, to help them do so in a way that is going to respect the environmental imperative, which is to do so on a sort of decarbonized path. And so, I think the possibility of asking developing countries to basically adopt a common, part of the common external trade policy, these sort of trade policies say, look, keep out carbon intensive steel and aluminum products. And in exchange, we will help you decarbonize or develop in a decarbonized way. That kind of approach makes a ton of sense to me. It's a way to build the club. It's a way to basically sort of spread, I think, U.S. values with respect to both trade and the environment. And I guess just by way of closing, Felicia and Ambassador Todd both started off by talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think, this has really, I think, changed the conversation here in ways that we're going to see a much greater emphasis on a trading system in which countries are thinking about what kind of shared values do we have with the countries that we are trading with, and what are the threats beyond the trading system that countries with whom we do business pose to peace and security and the environment. And in that vein, the idea that we would basically reach out to developing countries and help them decarbonize or help them develop on a decarbonized path really makes a lot of sense in a world in which those shared values are becoming increasingly important to how we define economic relationships.
Erin?
So briefly, I think the US has an obligation to build out and improve these technologies at scale, right? And part of this is technological transfer. And I'll let Professor Omarova talk more as well too on the side of also providing the financial incentives as well, and financial support, not just kind of these are the technologies where you can kind of build out your industry in a decarbonized way. It's on the financial side as well.
Saule, lead us out with some closing thoughts.
Well, the closing thought is quite simple. It is really exciting and encouraging to see this type of tangible progress toward decarbonization of our production and distribution of industrial goods and services. And the hope is that there will be an all-of-government approach to this problem, a very synergistic approach, because this is a complex problem, and we, the United States, need to lead the world in that direction.
Well, for all of us here on the panel and for our distinguished guest, we want to thank you, the audience members, for your participation, for your wonderful questions. I think that echoing something that all of our panelists said, the lessons of the last year have really been things that seemed Overton window pushing a year ago are now rapidly becoming policy, and that's due because of the intertwined crises that we're confronting as it relates to the pandemic, climate inequality, racial inequity in our economy, and now, of course, a state of international emergency. So it's time to think big. It's time to do big policy. We've got to take advantage of these windows when they exist. So again, thanks to all of you for joining, and for your colleagues who may have missed this chat but want to see it later, we will be posting a video shortly of this panel that you can share more broadly. And then I'd also invite you to stay tuned next month for our next webinar, where we're going to be featuring American Prospect co-founder Robert Kuttner and his new book about the Biden administration, Going Big, FDR's Legacy, Biden's New Deal, and the Struggle to Save Democracy. That'll be April 27th at 1 p.m. Kuttner will be in conversation with Heather McGee with introductory remarks from Felicia Wong. So would invite you to join us again for that and for the rest of our webinar series as well as we go throughout the spring and into the summer. So thanks again and onward.